Howdy guys, just a couple questions from my students about effectively what they've had over the past couple weeks. First one we have here is just talking about ways that we're going to be able to measure energy expenditure. So in a perfect world, best way to go about it is going to be doing direct calorimetry. So that's going to be being inside of actual rooms that are actually measuring the energy that you are exerting to the room, aka the temperature exchange. And we can also look at gas exchange, and that's more going to be indirect calorimetry. Now, a full room calorimeter that you could actually live inside, like as a bed, a toilet, and then maybe some basic exercise equipment, those are usually going to cost, easily six figures to install. Operation, probably just, a couple $1,000s depending on the length of which we're doing it, and that's going to be our best bet. Now, indirect calorimetry that we can do through resting metabolic rate from gas exchange, like wearing a mask and utilizing a metabolic cart, that's going to be, usually those are going to cost somewhere from a couple thousands into the tens of thousands pretty easily. Heart rate monitors, pretty cheap. Accelerometers, really cheap. In fact, they're typically incorporated into cell phones. So we're going from most accurate to least accurate, but also from cheapest to most expensive. So for most folks, usually utilizing something like a heart rate monitor, accelerometer, and then seeing how their body actually responds is going to be the best way to go about it. So we know there's going to be some inaccuracies with the accelerometer. It's going to record certain things and miss others. So if your accelerometer is wrist mounted, so we're wearing like a Fitbit, Garmin, something along those lines, if you're somebody that talks with your hands and moves a lot, that could get you a bunch more steps than you really took. So it's going to overestimate how many calories you burned. However, if you like to go and cycle, well, especially if you're doing something like a spin class or otherwise, it's not really catching a lot of movement. So in reality, you'll have done all that work and not really have good measurement for it. So we can do activity trackers. That's where heart rate monitors can be pretty useful. Of course, your heart rate's going to be elevated when you're stressed, when you've had a lot of caffeine or other types of amphetamines. So it's not necessarily always going to be the best indicator of how many calories we burn. So we're still looking at what's the global response, meaning are we gaining weight or we're losing weight, are we staying the same? If we know all the calories we're taking in, we know the activities we're doing that's adding to the calories going out, well, we can figure out, okay, were the exercise calories we burned enough to offset the food that we took in with the lens of a resting metabolic rate, non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, and thermic effect of food. So I'd say for most folks, heart rate strap, accelerometer, probably going to be a good place to start. We can get more granular if we're really interested and we've got the funds and the access to the equipment to do so. But for the most part, we're still looking at individual responses. And then, do we even really care about body weight manipulation in the first place? It's a good question to ask yourself. So, the question we had was, when it comes to hormones that are anabolic in nature, what makes them anabolic versus catabolic? Well, are they helping cause the increase in size in tissues or decreasing the size of tissues? So hence testosterone, growth hormone. Yes, growth hormone is catabolic to fat, but it's anabolic to pretty much everything else. Insulin is anabolic to everything it works on, which is going to be lean mass and fat mass. Whereas things like cortisol is catabolic. It's getting us to break down things, utilize it for energy. Glucagon is going to be catabolic. It's helping us release that glycogen from our liver, go through more gluconeogenesis, which requires other things to break down to go forward. So ask yourself, is it building or is it breaking things down? Now, when we talk about central nervous system fatigue and how it needs to recuperate, well, keep in mind, when we have the fatigue, it's a lot of things going on. Now, are we getting that type of neural drive? Do we have acetylcholine levels replenished? Are our neurons effectively ready to be tapped into? And really, maximal lifts require a whole lot of neural drive, which is going to be metabolically expensive to those neurons you're using inside the brain. Same type of thing that might happen whenever you're talking about being really just tired mentally from doing a lot of studying or really hard focused mental work. It turns out you're stressing certain neurons inside of your brain, which is making them utilize energy, and now we're going to be talking about building new connections and everything else, but that is going to be somewhat depleting. And so what we're really looking at is that same type of, we allow ourselves some time to recover. This can be steady breaks, this can be sleeping, things in order to help those systems recover. Now, when it comes to the lifting side of it, do keep in mind that you also are going to have damage to those muscle fibers, your type 2, and specifically those X fibers are going to be the ones that take a long time to replenish that phosphocreatine, and those are our biggest, most powerful fibers, which are really important for maximal lifts. So we want to make sure that we're giving ourselves adequate break between sets in a workout and then between training sessions, so that we're going to be able to tap into those fibers maximally. Now, when it comes to carnitine, remember it's not about releasing, it's about the CPT1-2 transfer of going from the cytosol, the cell sarcoplasmic muscles, into the mitochondria. And so the basic idea is we can increase then carnitine levels, which in theory would allow us to cycle fat through the cell, which would in theory allow us to burn more calories in the cell via fat, so beta oxidation. It doesn't really seem to be that advantageous. It might help a little bit. When I say that, it's not doubling, tripling, 10xing your fat metabolism. Might be adding like maybe 10%, so that might be useful if we're really talking about very specific weight loss times or energy production for aerobic athlete, but it's probably not going to be that ergogenic. Because remember, fats burn that much slower than carbohydrates, but it might help spare glycogen, which there are some situations where you might want to do that. So, good question. We're going to talk more about that actually in class when we get to supplementation. So, when we say a bigger body requires the heart to pump more blood, well, our cardiac output has to effectively cycle our blood to our tissues at rest effectively once per minute. That's just where we're at. Now, we're not going to really over pump blood to our body. We're going to only have that cardiac output enough to oxygenate our tissues at rest, meaning there's no other metabolic demands. Our brain's going to be thinking, our heart's going to be beating, our liver and digestive system is going to be doing their dance along with our kidneys, so we're still going to always have those demands. Now, muscle demands are going to really kick up as soon as we start exercising. Our heart's only pumping as hard as it needs to at rest. That's why people that are in really good aerobic condition, because they've got a bigger stroke volume, their resting heart rate is going to be lower. Now, additionally to that, what we're also going to find is individuals that have a smaller body in general, while they require a lower cardiac output, plus if they have that increased stroke volume, they're going to have an even lower resting heart rate. So we're not really ever going to have an issue where our heart rate is going to be pumping way more blood to our body than we need at rest. We're only going to do as much as we need to. The reason that heart rate is going to be elevated at rest is because there's some other stressful things going on in the body. Or we don't have as an efficient of a heart, lower ejection fraction, which in general it's really stemming all the way down to lower stroke volume. Because we're just trying to solve the math problem. We need a certain cardiac output, and the way we solve it is between the stroke volume and the heart rate, those two being multiplied together. We got a bigger stroke volume, we don't need as high of a heart rate, and vice versa. And finally, when it comes to better results in general for training, when it comes to should we do cardio first then weights, most would argue that the goal is to do your weight lifting before you do your cardiovascular training, just because the fatigue you're inducing from cardiovascular training is going to be more energy production, whereas when it comes to weight training, now we're talking about doing actual damage to our muscle fibers. So if you go into that training session for lifting weights and you're already depleted from your aerobic style training, you're going to have a much harder time training with weights that are going to be stimulatory enough. Now, perfect world, do more than one session per day. So do your weight training, eat some, do your cardiovascular training or vice versa. But we separate the two by probably 3 or more hours. If that's not an option, lift weights, then cardio, but then figure out what's more important to you. And then of course, is the type of aerobic training you're going to do, is that going to elicit fatigue and lower performance in the resistance training you're going to do? So if your cardio is going to be riding on a spin bike, and then your lifting is going to be upper body training, the organization and order doesn't really matter as much because you're probably not going to be carrying fatigue from one side of the body to the other. But if you're going to go for a long distance run and you got heavy squats, let's get those squats done first. Then let's go ahead and do some running. So, thank you guys for listening. Hope it was useful. Have a great day. Bye-bye.